Hello, today we'll be discussing skill practice. We're going to actually put all these lessons we've been learning into practice and drill. First, I'll give you a brief overview again of extraction, evaluation, and explanation. Then we'll delve right into skill practice in more detail, and I'll provide an example you can use to structure your discussion boards. So remember this relationship arguments, all those things that are premises aligned in a certain way that have one unique conclusion, potentially sub-conclusions, but just one conclusion. That's all in this first larger circle. Among those, we see valid arguments, the subset, which are arguments in which if the premises are true, then the conclusion is. And then, of course, we have sound arguments, the smaller subset. Here we have arguments in which, yep, that's right, you're way ahead of me, the premises are in fact true. Now, again, an argument is valid just in case all the premises are true, then the conclusion is. That doesn't mean all the premises are true. This definition applies by considering if the premises were true. If you have an argument with false premises, it's trivially valid. Okay? We just count it as valid. It's just easier to do it. What we're really concerned with, arguments in which if the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be. We're looking for that certainty between the premises and conclusion. That's the heart of validity. An argument is not valid is invalid. And to test for this, all you have to do is imagine a scenario in which the premises are all true, but the conclusion is not. If you can do that, then the argument is invalid. If there's any way for you to imagine the premises to be true, all of the premises to be true, and the conclusion to be false, that's a bad argument. For example, some pears are delicious, some pears are round. It does not follow that all delicious things are round. In fact, if that is the unique conclusion of your argument, that is not a valid argument. In fact, it's a pretty crappy argument. I want to emphasize this imagining test that I've just ran through is what we might call counterexample hunting. You are looking for a counterexample to the validity of the argument. And it's built into testing for validity, but it's important to sharpen your skill here. So I would like for you in your free time, because I know you have so much of it, take any invalid argument that we've discussed in class or one that's come up in class, just look at it. Take an invalid one and generate as many distinct scenarios in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false as you can. And you need to drill this to get in the habit of doing this. It becomes second nature after a while. But starting with an invalid argument and just generating the false conclusions with true premises, that's something you can train. And once you start seeing how it's done, it's sort of a recipe. Our argument is sound, of course, just in case it's valid and all the premises are true. And this is, as I've mentioned, the sort of argument the philosophers are interested in most often. Now, to test whether an argument is sound, we must evaluate the premises themselves to determine whether they are in fact true. This is not the same as testing, like, or using something like an imagining test to see if it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. We instead focus on the premises, and we have to either support them or reject them. Consider this. Determinism is true. Premise 1. Premise 2. If determinism is true, then the free will principle is false. Conclusion. Free will principle is false. This is a valid argument. Now, is it sound? If you believe this argument is sound, then you must provide justification for accepting line 1 is true and line 2 is true. If you think it's sound, both lines need support. For example, you might argue line 1 is true based on the fact that scientific progress appears to require it to be true. Similarly, you might argue line 2 is true based on the incompatibility arguments provided in a previous lecture. That would be evidence or support in favor of this second premise being true. If you believe this argument is unsound, now you must provide good reason or reasons to think at least one premise is false. So you have a bit of a lower burden here because you get to focus on just one premise. But you also have a bit of a higher burden because you need to come up with counterexamples, or at least one. For example, you might argue line 1 is false because human experience provides ample evidence that some actions are uncaused. That might make you question whether one is in fact true. On the other hand, you might object to line 2 by arguing determinism is in fact compatible with the free will principle, depending on how we understand cause and compulsion, etc., just as we saw in our discussion of soft determinism. Moving on to skill practice. And we're not going to simply be learning about arguments in this class, as you've probably picked up. We're also going to be learning how to argue well. And learning how to argue well takes practice, but it is a skill that can be trained. And the best way I've found to hone this is by trying to argue well, failing to, being corrected, trying again, and so on. Rinse and repeat. We will practice the skill of arguing well in just this manner. To help you focus, there'll be no quiz during skill practice weeks. If you want to know when those are, look in the syllabus. Instead, you'll be expected to construct an argument and post it to the discussion board for evaluation by your peers. Your argument must be rooted in the philosophical content covered in class. Do not just come up with an argument. I will become very irritated. For example, your argument for the first skill practice week must be related to one or more of the following topics: free will, determinism, compatibilism, indeterminism, etc. We want to train, but we want to train on this content. Your argument must also be represented in a valid premise conclusion form. I want to see some numbers. I want to see sub-conclusions if you need them, and only one conclusion. I want to see grammatical sentences, etc. You'll very likely have an if-then statement involved. And you must explain why the conclusion follows from the premises, which may be done, and I think the easiest way to do that is by identifying which valid argument pattern your argument instantiates. And if you would like to see a list of some of these argument patterns that are valid, go look at the week 1 handout where I provide several of them for your enjoyment. And perhaps most importantly during the skill practice, though, is you must provide justification for believing the premises of your argument are true. Remember, we're doing philosophy here, so we're interested in sound arguments, valid arguments with true premises, but you have to support them. You have to support these premises. Now, I will provide an example, and you can use this as a template, but don't duplicate it. Check it out. Here's an argument in premise conclusion form. 1. Sometimes people are morally responsible for their actions. 2. If 1 is true, then sometimes people act freely. Subconclusion. Hence, sometimes people act freely. Now, 4. If sometimes people act freely, then hard determinism is false. 5. Unique conclusion. Hence, hard determinism is false. Here are the premises. There are only 3 of them. Here is a subconclusion. Line 3. There's only 1 of them. In this argument, there could be more. There is 1 conclusion. Argument patterns instantiated in this argument are modus ponens. As you can see, if you have line 1 and 2, then 3 follows. That's modus ponens. Similarly, if you have 3 and 4, then 5 follows. Modus ponens. These are valid moves in this argument. Now, justification for the premises. All right, look at 1. Sometimes people are morally responsible for their actions. Look, it seems, here's a way to approach this. Our species attributes moral blame and praise to the law, social practice, and institutional norms. Seems to be good reason to think there is such a thing and that people are sometimes morally responsible for their actions. Otherwise, a lot of these practices don't really have any underpinning. Support 2, remember we have to support all the premises. If 1, then sometimes people act freely. Okay. So if people are sometimes morally responsible for their actions, then they could have done something different if they had chosen to do so. Seems to be the case that if we're going to attribute moral blame, for instance, to someone for something they've done, then we at least think they weren't compelled or overwhelmingly compelled to do what they've done, and so they could have, in fact, chosen to do something other than what they did. And this seems to be at least part of what it means to act freely. Support. Last premise, sometimes people act freely, then hard determinism is false. Well, if people sometimes act freely, then not every event has a prior cause, since a natural understanding of acting freely requires that acts not be determined. Now I want to pause here and say that each of these justifications I've provided for these premises has a rebuttal that could be offered. So you could respond. There is something that could be said in response to each of them, and that is what I would like for you to do when you are responding to the posts of others. Focus on the justification that is provided in the initial post and poke holes in it. See if you can throw doubt over your peers and their justification for the premises. For instance, if somebody were to write, if sometimes people act freely, then not every event has a prior cause, since a natural understanding of acting freely requires that acts not to be determined. As support for line 4, one way to press on this is, what does it mean to have a natural understanding of acting freely? That's one avenue. Another is it the case that acting freely does require that acts not be determined?